Now, today we are discussing corruption as a case study. It's all eyes on Kenya. Coincidentally, I'm here on my baby moon with my wife and my 9-month-old baby Louis, and I believe this place is a dream. While the people are so loving, caring, and prided on the collective sense of community, today's lecture will show you how culture can affect challenges in leadership and accountability that altogether create a behemoth of corruption. And of course, there are international pressures, financial pressures, and all kinds of other pressures that she will speak on as well, affecting accountability and leadership. So there's much, much more, of course, but I'll let the speaker take you on this ride. I would like to introduce our speaker for tonight. Her name is Sheila Masinde. She's the Executive Director at Transparency International Kenya. She was formerly their head of programs and has been through the ranks of research and learning management as well. She's got all kinds of experience, expertise, and exposure, being involved in the BBC as well. So trust that we are in very good hands. Without further ado, Sheila, welcome to the Center of Pan-African Thought. Thank you for being with us tonight. I will be sharing your presentation on my screen, so the floor is yours. Once again, smaller group, feel free to chat, to speak fluid, informally if you want, but no worries at all. Go ahead, Sheila, you may unmute as well.
Thank you very much, Mark, and all the participants who have made time to join, despite starting earlier than you usually do. Thank you very much for accommodating me. I do hope that we'll have more people joining in, but I think that because you're recording it, that lots of people will still be able to watch. So I greet the others as well who will be watching it later after this session. So I'm sorry, again, my voice may go up, may go high and low. My voice is disappearing a little bit. There's someone who's just joking that we've been talking too much about the Pandora Papers, and so someone has decided to take my voice to an offshore location because we've really gone hard on the Pandora Papers, because our president's family, the first family, has been mentioned. And so we've just been calling for some aspects in terms of accountability in regard to those investigations and the findings of those reports of the Pandora's Papers. So just onto my presentation, but first of all, maybe to introduce Transparency International. TI Kenya is an autonomous chapter of the Global Transparency International movement that is bound by a common vision of an anti-corruption, of a corruption-free world. We were founded in Kenya in 1999, so we've been working here for the last 22 years, and we're a not-for-profit organization, and our aim in Kenya really is to develop a transparent and corruption-free society through good governance and social justice initiatives. So that's just a little bit about TI. On to the topic of today, I said that I was going to talk about accountable leadership and why leadership, you could be asking, is because for us in Kenya, it's been one key factor that we have considered in regard to turning the tide against corruption. And then also where we are now as a country, we believe that it is a watershed moment for Kenya. We have our elections, and we refer to them really as transitional elections, because our incumbent, the president will be leaving office, having done his 2 terms. And so we expect quite a contested election, but also we are looking forward to it so that we can be able to change the quality of leadership and ensure that this time we actually have leaders with integrity. We have implemented a constitution for the last 11 years, which provides for national values and principles of governance. which are supposed to be binding to all state organs, the state officers, public officers. And maybe Mark, if you can go to the next slide, sorry. And so for us, this coming election really gives us a point to try and see how we can be able to infuse those values into our leadership. Good governance, integrity, transparency, accountability. Our constitution, our current constitution, devotes an entire chapter to issues around leadership and integrity, setting ethical standards for any person who's seeking to be a candidate for any state office. And we say that those qualities must be complied with by anyone seeking to serve Kenyans. Unfortunately, this has not really been the case. Maybe, Mark, if you can move on to the next. This has not been the case, despite having implemented that constitution for now 11 years, since 2010. We normally say that, in fact, this constitution, particularly the provisions on leadership and integrity, have been observed more in breach rather than compliance. I think our constitution is very clear in regard to the qualities of leadership. It states that, leadership is a public trust. It is to be exercised in a manner that is consistent with the purposes and objectives of the Constitution. It must demonstrate respect for the people. It must bring honor to the nation and the dignity to the office. And also it must promote public confidence in the integrity of that office. Unfortunately, that's not really what we have seen in regard to the people who have led us before the Constitution and even after the Constitution. If you look at the number of people who are currently in court for corruption, a lot of them have been serving state or public officers, whether elected or appointed. So then that begs the question of whether we have really been effective in terms of implementing provisions of our law and constitution, our supreme law, the Constitution, in regard to leadership and integrity. I just listed some other provisions in our Constitution which touch on leadership and integrity. I talked about earlier our national values and principles of governance. Then we have that chapter on leadership and integrity. There's even an article there which talks about financial probity of state officers. In fact, it's something that people are now talking about now that we have the president's family mentioned in the Pandora Papers in regard to financial probity and whether that is against or is in line with the Constitution in terms of what is expected of leaders and how they conduct themselves. They're not allowed to hold foreign bank accounts. Well, of course it's not illegal here to have an offshore company and so on, or to take money abroad. But then there've just been questions around whether, if at all, that the president had declared some of these assets that his family has abroad, or some of these companies that have been foundations that have been started abroad under his name, or whether where he's listed as a beneficiary. So there are questions whether he actually declared that. So it's a big heated debate here at the moment, but we'll see within coming days how he's able to account for that, because he has promised that he will be giving a more comprehensive statement to the nation in regard to those investigations under the Pandora's Papers. The other law I think I wanted to highlight, because this touches on how we vet and elect people in this country, is that under our Elections Act, we expect anyone who's vying in the elections for any of the seats, whether it's at the local ward level or at the county level or at the national level, whether we have the Senate, as part of the legislature, we have the National Assembly, those two form the parliament. and of course also the presidency. It expects that all candidates in an election should comply with certain ethical and integrity requirements. That is a condition for qualification in the elections. But then unfortunately, then if one would ask then, why are we here as a country where we have a number of leaders who have been accused of corruption? Some have been impeached. Some have been, asked by the court to step aside until their cases are concluded in court. A lot of them are under investigation. So you'd ask, if you have all these provisions in regard to leadership and integrity, why then do we find ourselves where we are as a country in regard to corruption? Why do we find that we have really, we are not in a desired state in terms of accountability in our leadership? Maybe we can go to the next slide, Mark. Yeah, so I just shared that montage of newspaper headlines, different newspaper headlines, just really reflecting the number of scandals we've had as a country in the last few years. And this is actually all reported under the current administration's term. This administration came into office on a platform of fighting corruption. Their manifesto was very rich in terms of the promises that had been given to Kenyans in regard to the fight against corruption. But then you see, in fact, this is not all the cases. There are many more. And the sad thing is, I think of all these cases I've shared, there's only one where someone has been convicted. I think if you look at the bottom, the middle column at the bottom, where they talk about the sports ministry. Yeah, we had a scandal during the Rio Olympics of 2016. It's only just about 3 weeks ago, where the minister who was in charge and some of the other officials who are leading the team were actually convicted and fined. But then there are also complaints that the conviction wasn't strong enough, wasn't punitive rather enough, and that he got a light fine, which was really like a slap on the wrist. So there are also questions around how that our cases take so long to be investigated and then prosecuted and adjudicated. And by that time, almost an average of 5 to 7 years, and 5 to 7 years is really a long time for a corruption case. In fact, many of these cases, by the time they're getting to their 5th year, you find that several witnesses have died. Some of the accused have also died. And so the case almost collapses. Then there are also questions around the quality of investigations and prosecutions. So we found that a lot of people have gotten off without really being punished. And we find that then that encourages, the cycle of corruption to continue, because that there's no really strong deterrence, to prevent corruption, because people are not getting punished. Resources that have been stolen are not getting recovered. So, and then that in the end also leads to a sense of apathy, indifference, defeat, kind of a defeatist attitude among citizens, because they feel that, okay, this is all too much. There's nothing really that can be done to fight corruption. So currently that's where we are as a country, even in terms of the state among citizens, that people feel that, there's really nothing much that can be done because people have not been punished as would be expected. Maybe if you can just go to the next slide, just have a little bit more about corruption in terms of just setting the context.
One question, Sheila, for our audience,
yes.
How much is 1 billion Kenya shillings in USD?
1 billion is 100 billion, about 100 billion. Yeah, 100 billion, yeah. So in terms of just going further on the status of corruption, government reports say that we lose an estimated of 30% of our annual budget to corruption. So this year, our budget is 3.08 trillion Kenya shillings. So that's about 300 trillion US dollars. So then would expect at the end of the year that maybe the Auditor General will tell us that we have lost about say how much would that be? 300, well, say about 100 trillion thereabouts, because we're losing about a third of the annual budget to corruption. That has been the case, I think, for the last 10 years, when it was first stated by a high-ranking official in Treasury, in the Ministry of Finance, and that has been repeated by officials of the Anti-Corruption Commission and even the Auditor General. In fact, earlier this year, none less than the President said that we're losing 2 billion shillings a day, Kenya shillings a day. 2 billion shillings, I think that's about 20 million US dollars, if I'm not wrong. Yeah, about 20 million US dollars a day is lost daily to corruption, according to the President. In fact, for me, when I calculated back and looked at the other estimates, it was actually an understatement. He actually underreported it. Yeah, I've already said that there are various corruption cases under investigation or in court in regard to how we perform compared to, other nations. When you look at the Corruption Perception Index produced by Transparency International, in the Corruption Perception Index of 2020, we had 31 points out of 100. On a scale of 0 to 100, 0 being very corrupt, 100 being clean. So on that scale, we sit at 31, and though that was an improvement of 3 points from 2019, when we scored 28 points. So not really doing well, because we fall below the average, the sub-Saharan average of 32, and the global average of 43 points in the Corruption Perceptions Index. If you can move to the next, please. Yes, I also wanted to share the other thing that we struggle with as a result of corruption is the public debt. The debt burden is currently very high. We're currently at 7.7 trillion. 7.7 trillion. That is. Well, I'll try to calculate back. I wasn't really good at math. Yeah, but 7.7 trillion Kenya shillings. But if you just use the exchange rate, would be for $1 US, you have 100 Kenya shillings. But then there's been a lot of hue and cry because lending institutions, including the IMF, continue to approve loans for Kenya. In fact, one of the last times that they approved a few months ago, there was this really huge hue and cry on Twitter, and Kenyans even storming some of the online IMF meetings, just to say, please stop granting Kenya the loans, because we can't pay, and we're losing all that money to corruption, because there's been a lot of suspicion in regard to how we're using that money. Ideally, the loans that we are borrowing should be used for development, but in many cases, the government is unable to pinpoint, what exactly have we developed, is, whether it's infrastructure, build a hospital. Yes, there are cases where that has happened, but then there are many cases still where, they can't really show what those loans have been spent on. Sometimes these monies have then been used to serve for recurrent expenditure, like paying government salaries. So that's also been a concern, that why are we borrowing money to pay, or support recurrent expenditure. Another concern has been that we are borrowing to pay debts, because we are highly indebted. So we are really, and we can't service these loans. And so we are forced to borrow to pay our loans. So that cycle is then expected to continue, because we'll keep taking loans. We can't pay, so we'll borrow to pay, and that then cycle continues. And then the other phenomena we're also struggling with is that by the time we're borrowing money, that money is actually designed to be stolen. Our budgets, there's a high suspicion that our budgets are highly padded, meaning that whenever those budgets are being developed, there's a lot of monies are really not required, but are put in there because that is then what will be siphoned, out of the public coffers. So that's another concern in regard to management of debt, and that's really been concerning. In the next slide, I'll just rush through this one, I'm just highlighting how corruption has been so adverse in this country, to the point where even when we're really struggling with COVID-19, at the height of the pandemic, and in Africa, I think we're one of when you look at the top 10 countries, Kenya is among those most affected in terms of the number of infections and even the number of deaths. I guess because we're in terms of we're a relatively bigger economy in Africa, and there's a lot of movement of people and so on. And so when you look at how we have been affected, we've taken quite a hit from the COVID-19 pandemic. But then even at the height of that, when people were sick, losing lives, losing livelihoods, a lot of people have lost their jobs. We found that monies that were supposed to purchase PPEs, to help those people at the front line, the health workers, the doctors, the nurses, to buy medicines and so on, was actually lost in botched procurement processes. Now, the sad thing is, more than 15 months since these cases came to light, no one has been held accountable. No one has been taken to court. No one has been convicted. They claim that investigations are still being conducted. That's more than 15 months after the theft of the COVID-19, not all the COVID-19 funds, but a part of the COVID-19 funds. So that's been a concern, because for us, that's the most egregious form of corruption, to steal from people when they're down on their knees, sick, or when they have to watch their loved ones dying because of this pandemic. And in fact, we ask ourselves whether things would have been better, because as I said, we're among the most affected African countries. But where would we be if some of those resources had been well spent? Would we have been able to save more lives? Would we have been able to avert some of those infections? Because we would have put in and bought all these items that would have been required, whether it is the sanitizers or the gloves or others, because a lot of the medics have also been affected. And it is claimed that some of them have been affected. We've lost some of them because they didn't have sufficient or adequate PPEs. So that I thought that is important to share. I think the next slide is about the Pandora Papers, but I think I've already talked about that. I think the main concern here has been around our wealth declaration system. And I think I talked about it, that currently it's really difficult to even track this. Our public officers are expected to file wealth declaration forms every 2 years, not just on their wealth, but also declare their wealth of their spouses, the income, assets, and liabilities of themselves, their spouses, and any children under 18 years. But even though that happens, there's really no process of ensuring that, of verifying this information, tracking this information, such that I can look at your wealth declaration form, that the one that you have filed this year, and compare it to what you filed 4 years ago or when you came into public service. So then I can be able to track, okay, if you have been able to accumulate this much in this last couple of years, is that commensurate to what you have been earning, whether as a registered income from the government or whether you have any other business. Yeah, because there's been a lot of concern that a lot of people have unexplained wealth, a lot of people working in government. And there's been some progress in terms of, especially by the Anti-Corruption Commission, undertaking civil or court proceedings to try and recover some of this unexplained wealth. But it's still a big problem. And we think that if we have a more elaborate wealth declaration and lifestyle audit system, that will be a strong tool to fight corruption in the public sector. So I thought I should mention that in relation to what we're currently debating on the Pandora's Papers. So maybe just lastly, as I conclude the presentation, I just wanted to say also, it's not all doom. I like, like the mythical Pandora's box. there were many things that came out. There was the evils and all the bad things, but then what was left in the box was hope. So I'd also like to just share some hope in regard to what we're doing, what we have been doing to enhance leadership and integrity. So as I mentioned, we're really looking forward to this particular period, and that's why I chose this topic of leadership, because I also would like to hear maybe from your own reflections, what has worked maybe in your countries in regard particularly to ensuring that you're able to elect leaders of integrity, because we are at that point where we're really debating. Come next year, in 10 months, we'll be going to the ballot, and we want to ensure that Kenyans have a cleaner slate to choose from in regard to those people who finally have their names end up on the ballot papers. So one of the things that we have been doing, starting from the last elections that we had in 2017, to influence the election of leaders with integrity, is I'll talk about a campaign we had and which we're planning to have again. We called it the Red Card Campaign, which is really about vetting leaders. So what we did is we collected all the reports of competent accountability institutions, the investigative authorities, reports from Parliament, reports of the Auditor General, and just listed names of leaders who had been implicated in various cases. Some were still being investigated, some had already been taken to court, some had already been decided. So we put together a list. We kept it to a list of 20, but our other authorities, the state authorities like the Anti-Corruption Commission, actually had its own list of 106 names. So we had our list of 20, and with this list of 20, we went round, to the media, to the various institutions responsible for vetting, to the political parties, to the religious leaders, and said, these people should not be cleared to vie for office because they have unresolved ethical issues. Let them clear their issues first. If they're cleared, then yes, they can offer themselves in another election. But for this election, let their names be kept off the ballot. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. I think it's just one attempt by one of the political parties which blocked one person, and not even a person from the list of 20. Because what we also decided to do, we chose 20 people who are, looking at the kind of cases that they were dealing with, and the kind of monies that were in question, either to have been lost or misappropriated. So that's why we just prioritized those 20. Most of those 20 were actually cleared to vie. Many of them were re-elected, because what we also did when we didn't succeed with the political parties, we didn't succeed with the election management body to block them from vying. We went to the citizens and told them, please don't vote for these people, they have issues. So we tried to decampaign them. But a lot of them were re-elected. But the interesting thing is, which really is a validation of what we did, that we were onto something good or something right, was many of those names. If I was to produce those names and then I produce the list of people currently being investigated or in court, you will see it is the same names. Only this time they have been accused of fresh corruption or other criminal cases. So meaning that they shouldn't have been cleared to vie in the first place. So that really has given us impetus for the next year. We're currently preparing to have this campaign again. We learned our lessons in terms of what we could have done better. And we really think that this is still something we need to do. We also have been involved in public interest litigation. We've gone up to the highest court of this land, that is the Supreme Court, just to also get the court's interpretation of what should happen to people who are being investigated, or who have been who have been charged in court, whether they should really actually be allowed to vie, or asked to, just clear their names first, step aside, and then wait, to conclude or be cleared from the court process. The other thing that we're doing, maybe if you can move to the next slide. Yeah, so we have also some challenges with some of our laws. Maybe first I'll talk about our laws on the elections and corruption, because one would then ask that if we already have Chapter 6 of the Constitution on leadership and integrity, we have a law that follows that is supposed to ensure implementation of that chapter of the Constitution and the Leadership and Integrity Act. And the Leadership and Integrity chapter, together with our chapter and provisions on the elections, require candidates to be people who have, not been accused of corruption, people of integrity. Then one would ask them, why do we then have difficulties in terms of having people who have been accused of corruption or who are currently in court, who have not been cleared? Then why haven't they been stopped from running in the elections? Why haven't they been stopped from holding office? It is because what we have in the Constitution is not what we have in our laws. When our laws were being developed and debated in Parliament, the parliamentarians actually conspired to really dilute the provisions of the law. So the law as we have it does not speak to the provisions of our Constitution. It was very diluted, it's very weak. And what we've been trying to do is advocate for its for certain amendments, particularly amendments that provide for the barring of persons who have been convicted under our Anti-Corruption and Economic Crimes Act, from holding elected or appointed public office or being appointed to public office, and also having provisions that stops anyone who has been who's being investigated or who has been charged in court from vying until they're cleared. So we're trying to push for some of those amendments at the moment in Parliament. It's not easy, many hurdles ahead, because in our country, again, we've seen that politicians, it's very hard to push accountability provisions with them, because they have an interest, because those are the same provisions that may block them. So you find that it's very difficult to push some of these accountability provisions, but we're going to try and see what we can do. But that's one way in which we're trying to address these issues around, leadership and integrity. Maybe to the next slide. Yeah, I think the other thing I wanted to also speak about, because it also touches on leadership and integrity, is campaign financing. Yeah, in Kenya, it's really been a fertile ground for corruption. In fact, every election here has been followed by an earth-shaking scandal, if I can use those words. Some of the headlines that I shared earlier, some of those scandals actually came just right after the election. And so there's always been that suspicion that a lot of the scandals that we see just before an election year or just after were actually, to ensure that certain candidates or certain political parties mobilized funds for the elections. Now, the challenge we have is that we have an election campaign finance law, which was enacted in 2013. That's 8 years ago. But 8 years on, it hasn't been implemented because the members of parliament have not passed regulations to implement that law. So before every election year, what happens is when these regulations are presented to parliament, they go something like, okay, these regulations came too late, or there's some technical issue around it, and so they defer the operationalization of that law until the next election. So that happened in 2017. 2013, of course, the law was deferred to 2017. 2017, it was deferred to the 2022 elections, which is next year. But then this, just a few weeks ago, they repealed those regulations and then said, okay, it doesn't look like we're going to operationalize this law until the next election. So now we're looking at having that law, suspended in perpetuity. I don't know until when. So, but largely, the stubbornness that we're seeing and the unwillingness to implement this is largely because no one wants to be held accountable. They don't want to be, politicians don't want to be held accountable for, their sources of campaign funding, the amounts that they're getting, or even how they're spending, this funds. And then what then happens is that leadership positions have become the preserve of a few elites in this country, because we are now excluding majority of Kenyans, particularly women, who are not able to raise the amount of money that are spent in the elections, young people and people with disabilities and other traditionally politically disenfranchised populations. So that's really the concern right now. There's also that concern that there's a lot of dirty money that's pumped into the elections. Of course, I said because from money that has been stolen through corruption and other proceeds of crime, drug money, money from human trafficking, wildlife crime, and so on. There are those concerns that a lot of that money is being used in our elections. But then now with MPs' unwillingness to regulate and ensure that there's accountability on the sources and the amounts of funds, then it becomes really difficult to police this. The other concern is also that because of that, there's been a lot of electoral malpractices, voter bribery, voter buying, voter intimidation, and also electoral violence, amongst other electoral malpractices, which continue unabated. And then this prevents us to actually get leaders with integrity, because those with integrity will stay off the elections and they're not even able to afford campaigns in any case, given the amount of money that others spend. What we have done in TI, we have developed a portal, which we call Campaign Watch, where we are asking Kenyans to give us reports on the misuse of public resources, because that's another area of concern, that a lot of our public resources are used in the elections, especially by people who are in office, but then vying, So we have developed a portal where people can then be able to report to us, and then we can use this and provide this as evidence to the authorities. Maybe if you can go to the next slide, that will be my last slide. And the other thing we're doing, we have also tried to create a database of corruption cases, so as we can promote information, give information to Kenyans. What we do is we collect all concluded corruption cases. We're also trying to start collecting ongoing cases, but really is to have an e-database, an electronic database, where Kenyans can be able to log on and then just look at the names of people appearing in some of those cases, such that they can then use this as information that, this person actually has a case in court, or this person has been convicted, he shouldn't be voted for. So we are now looking at that to promote, access to information, to enhance accountable leadership. Yeah, so I think those are some of the little things we're doing to be able to promote accountable leadership despite the various challenges that we face. Maybe I'll stop there, Mark, and then engage further. So thank you. That's Kiswahili for thank you. Asante.
Asante, Sheila. Thank you very much for that presentation. Thank you to the audience as well for your questions. In the interest of time, we're going to move straight into some of these. Sheila, if we have your attention, I have a question from Ola. He says, good evening. He or she, I'm so sorry. Good evening. How can Kenya turn a corner with corruption if it is tied to a world system that encourages it in order to help old colonizers maintain their hold on the African economies?
Hola. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think it's a question. I mean, we've had discussed here as well, and looked at the whole impact of even just globalization moving forward, but also where have we come from, you know, in terms of where did it all start? Because we know that, and in fact, just looking at the Pandora Papers, because that mentioned the president's family, and our president is a son of the first president. And so already what Kenyans were saying that, he has old wealth, he has old riches. Even the time when Kenya was getting independence, that was an opportunity for our founding fathers to loot from the public, yeah. But then what enabled them? What are the systems that enable them? Coming at that point from colonization. And then, of course, just looking at how the world is connected and where even some of these resources that are being stolen are being stashed. I think there's been a great concern about, the regulations or standards of integrity in the other countries. And yeah, I think all of that's really, I don't know whether I can really comprehensively answer your question. I think it's really food for thought as we think forward in terms of those systems of kleptocracy and that we have to really dismantle if we're really going to break away, and turn that corner away from corruption. Yeah, it's not something that we can do alone. I think when I look at your comments, not something that we can do alone as a country. There's things that we can do here, but then there are those things that we really have to, discuss as a community of nations to be able to break away from corruption.
Thank you for that answer, Sheila. Well considered, and I would definitely agree. Food for thought. Now we have a question from Saron, who says, what are the main methods of corruption in Kenya, and with what countries and or banks?
Yeah, the main methods of corruption, of course, there's grand corruption. Many of those that you're showing down the screen are really forms of grand corruption. We have mostly, embezzlement, fraud, abuse of office. Then there's petty corruption as well, which normally would largely affect, the everyday interactions among citizens and service providers. But I don't like calling it petty because I look at the impact it has. Because when you even look at a lot of the petty corruption is largely also in the security sector, such that you find that there's corruption maybe within the borders, such if when then a security person and if it's an immigration officer is paid, say, $1, or $2 to be able to look aside so that someone can cross the border without scrutiny. But then what is the impact of that on our security? Because that also Kenya has been largely affected in regards to terrorism. I think we seem to be managing it better now, but a few years ago, you remember some of those issues we had in the lives we've lost to acts of terrorism. And there are concerns that it's actually petty corruption that was enabling some of these terrorists and criminals to, walking into our country, literally, just because they have bribed $5 or less to our security persons. So that's why I don't like to underplay the impact of petty corruption. Also looking at petty corruption, another area where it has been largely is in the key service delivery sectors like health and education. But then if it happens in health, what does it mean in terms of access to medicine, access to quality healthcare? And then does that then in the event that healthcare is denied, what does that mean in terms of sustaining lives? We've lost lives because of petty corruption, in the health sector. So yeah, this petty corruption, but I think for me is just as bad as a grand corruption, where we have lost much more at a bigger scale. Of course, there's concern around especially with the grand corruption, because people are stealing from Kenyan coffers, from Kenyan taxpayers, and then stashing this in foreign jurisdictions. And so there's that concern as well. And then now there's more attention also to the corporate service providers, or the enablers, people who enable this money to move out of the country to some of those foreign jurisdictions, the professional enablers, the lawyers, the banks, the wealth management advisors, and so on. So but especially for the banks, there's been a lot of focus, because 5 years ago, there was one big scandal where a lot of banks, more than 10 of them, were found culpable. I think if you look at the second column of the pictures I've shared, the second column, the third story, how banks cleaned dirty NYS billions, because it was found that banks were accepting, deposits of millions of shillings, of dollars, without really asking those people or doing any due diligence, what they call know your customer check, and finding out, okay, who's this, where are they getting this money, where is it being transferred, because someone would come and is doing like more than 10 transfers in a day, across the counter, and you're not asking any questions. And so a lot of banks were fined, several of our banks were fined. And so banks now have become a little bit strict. We also have some of our oversight and supervisory institutions, like the central bank. We also have the Financial Reporting Center, and other institutions which have been formed under the Proceeds of Crime and Anti-Money Laundering Law, which are now, kind of really trying to step up, especially in regard to illicit financial flows, and also really working with foreign governments. We are also at least happy that a lot of the foreign governments have also offered cooperation and mutual assistance. So there have been those agreements that have been signed and agreed with foreign governments and foreign entities to help with the asset tracing and recovery efforts. And so we've seen some of these monies that have been stashed abroad also coming back to the country. There's still a lot out there, but there's been a little bit of progress. Not to the scale that we would wish for, but at least it's still something. Because I think when these monies are recovered, when people are punished for it as well and spotlighted, then it serves as a deterrence measure to corruption.
Thank you very much for that answer. In the interest of time, I think we will take one or two more points. I currently have one from Ola, and this is more your opinion on sort of the international financial system and its role in all of this. If I borrow money to mortgage my house and I default, why would you lend me more money? Is the bank being benevolent or mischievous?
That's a thing we've asked, for instance, with some of these international lenders. All our answers, I can't see the question here, but I would imagine, I've seen it. Yeah, but I would imagine, that is in relation to the question or the challenges we've had around public debt. It's a question we've asked IMF and some of the other lenders, that if you can see that we are really living with beyond our means, we need to cut our cloth according to size, but you're still giving us more money. Every time the government asks for money, you're just throwing it at us. And yet, that we are having difficulties having difficulties paying that money, but even more so is a question around how that money has been used. For instance, this year, IMF had an agreement with the government when they were given their last lending or last facility. And all these things that the government was supposed to do in terms of access to information, beneficial ownership, transparency in public procurement, all these measures in regard to anti-corruption. It's not so clear whether that has happened, at least from where I sit. Maybe there are reports that have been shared, but in terms of just visibility of whether some of those measures have actually been implemented, it's not so clear for me that those have been done. But then IMF had said that there would be timelines and they would follow up to ensure that the government actually follows through some of these commitments. But then I doubt whether many of them have been actually actualized. But yeah, it's a valid question of whether these people really mean the best for us. Some of these institutions mean the best for us, whether it is really genuine help and assistance, or really they're just helping us to dig ourselves deeper into that hole.
I have a question for you. In your experience at Transparency International, have you or maybe any other watchdog been cracked down on, stopped in your tracks, or sort of put to zero by a powerful target of yours, or candidate, or politician, or someone who's got enough authority to intervene? Have you seen watchdogs be controlled through corruption as well?
Well, I would say in Kenya for the last 20 years, the environment has been, in terms of our work, it hasn't really been that restrictive. Especially between 2002 and 2012, we really had an open environment. We enjoy freedom of expression. We enjoy freedom of association. These are all fundamental rights granted in our constitution. And so you find that for a lot of civil society organizations working on governance, we're free to speak, we're free to do things. We take government to court, but we're still able to work. There are different levels of engagement. We take them to court, but we can still be able to sit with them across the table and discuss things and even give technical support. During the last 10 years, the civic space has been a bit restrictive, not as open as it was between 2002 and 2012. But when I compare with other African countries, I think that it could be better. Yeah, it could be better, and we probably still need to ensure that we do much more to defend our civic space and protect it. But I still think that there's a high degree of freedom of expression and association. So that in terms of people being, especially groups like NGOs, it has happened for some of the human rights organizations where there'll be trumped up accusations that they're not fully registered or things like that. Maybe for individuals, there have been individuals like whistleblowers, bloggers who have been, affected or maybe attacked, but still, it hasn't stopped people from speaking.
Will you be red carding your current president? Does he know?
Well, he's not vying. We don't expect him to vie for anything because he's done his 2 terms as president. So I doubt whether he will be vying for anything. He said that he wants to go into retirement. We're still going through we want to make sure that it has to be a very thorough process. We're going through various reports to just look at people who have been caught with their hand in the cookie jar this time round, and looking at the criteria we have, see who needs to be red carded.
Wow. Well, finally, I would just like your 2 cents on this, and I'll let you go. South Africa's former president Jacob Zuma is, recently been in the news for being taken to court and losing that battle. And right now, these papers, the Pandora Papers, are showing other leaders, including Kenya's, in all kinds of implication. What do you think is the landscape for Africa's leadership then? Are we becoming more zero tolerance? Are we cracking down? Do we have enough? We know that you're doing great work at TI, but what does that mean for the average African, both at home and abroad? And what does the future seem like to you?
I think the future is, in terms of citizens being able to hold their leaders to account. I think the future looks bright in that regard for especially the African countries which have largely been able to live by the democratic principles. I think, for instance, if you look at the impact of some of these investigations, even just the journalist investigations like the Pandora Papers, it's very, the impact is huge, particularly because it's bringing some of these shadowy activities and companies to light. And for us in Kenya, that it's now forcing the president to say that, I'm going to speak about it. And he's even acknowledged the role that some of these actions by journalists and investigations play in terms of unveiling financial secrecy. But it gives us opportunities as Africans to elevate, that platform for accountability and hold our leaders to greater account. When I look at what has happened, for instance, in South Africa, and I think it gives us that hope that even if someone does something and commits an action or a breach while in office, that you can still go after them. I think that communicates for me and gives us hope that we can hold these people to account. They're not demigods, that cannot be punished for misdeeds, in regard to actions or decisions they have made that have come to affect our countries. So when I look at some of these things happening, I really think that there's this hope, and even for people who will be coming after, in terms of leadership, they're coming onto a space knowing that even if I have 10 years in this office, there could be a time when I could still be recalled to be held accountable or asked questions in terms of my own actions or actions of my associates. So I have a high degree of hope, but maybe it's because I'm in Kenya, and as I said, in Kenya we've generally been able to speak freely and act freely about some of these things.